So welcome to the last session in our month-long webinar series exploring strategic recovery for COVID-19 and emerging models around that from around the world. I will be the moderator today with Courtney. I'm Svetla Baiva. I'm currently the communications lead at the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub for Europe and Central Asia. And this webinar series is currently done in collaboration with the UNDP Innovation Networks at Asia Pacific and the Istanbul Regional Hub at UNDP for Europe and Central Asia. So a big thank you from both regions and for everyone that's been able to, that has been able to join us today. So we started and kicked off our webinar series earlier this month. In part A, we looked at systemic investment with climate kick, and we explored social capital and infrastructure networks in our panel webinar with Ashoka and Catalyst 2030. And we're super excited that this series is coming to an end with part B. If you missed it, we yesterday had our third webinar that focused on exploring a mission-oriented and multi-stakeholder approach to solving a part of the plastics pandemic. And we learned about how a systems approach can be used, and more specifically, more practically, how it was actually planned and how it is currently unfolding on the ground. There were a lot of great insights and lessons learned. So if you weren't able to catch it, we'll be circulating this recording this week. So today we'll be wrapping up our series on funding systems change and exploring emergent models with a deep dive into what it means to navigate complexity, risk, and uncertainty. And for sure, for everyone, I think it's very relevant at the moment with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has really highlighted the vulnerability of our key infrastructure and institution. And the natural response has been to impose control-based risk management processes, but we're really seeing that this might not be suited for such wide-sweeping crises as we're seeing right now and as we have seen in the past as well. And in this webinar, what our goal is to really look at how to embrace uncertainty, how to anticipate and prepare for unknown conditions, to turn these risks into opportunities. Especially within UNDP and in our ever-changing environment. So we're really going to dig deep into kind of looking at more theoretically into the principles of what this means, which is a bit in contrast into what we've seen in the last couple of sessions. But we think that this could be very good guidance and give us principles on which to step on and organize our work. So today we have with us Torben Andersen, Professor of Strategy and International Management, and also the Director of the Global Strategic Responsiveness Initiative at the Copenhagen Business School. And he's going to share some of his insights on approaches to dealing with emergent crises, specifically highlighting the central role of innovation and experimentation in tackling radical uncertainty. So a quick note, before we begin, if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the dedicated Q&A window. We really like you to feel like this is an informal conversation that, meant to spark questions and dialogue. So feel free to share your insights, concerns, questions as we go along with the session. So without further ado, I'd like to give the mic, so to speak, to Torben. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this series. Incidentally, as the last presenter, I did follow the previous sessions, if not online, then post hoc, and found it very interesting. I also realized with the participants around the world, there are some high expectations when you take out an hour from your busy work. So hopefully this will be or inspire some fruitful thinking. I have prepared some slides, so I'll try to load them on, share them. Can you all see them? Svetla, yeah. Can you confirm that at least you can see it? Yes, the title is really Strategic COVID-19 Recovery. To be honest, I don't know how much we talked about COVID-19, but of course, it's an example of a major event that has impacted everyone. And it can make us think about how we deal with such unexpected events. It's a very good example of unexpected situations that emerge, and we need to do something, and we didn't think about it before. So it's actually straight into some of the issues that I'm trying to deal with in my both research and teaching. So just I'll press the button here, and hopefully that works. No, it doesn't. So how do I move these slides forward? Here we go. I just press harder. Anyways, just a very brief introduction about my own background. Not that people need to know in detail who I am, but it's more to understand where my views and insights might come from. So going way back, don't guess my age, but I was trained as a financial economist, and I worked for more than a decade as an international banker and investment banker, also management consultant. So I guess I have a pretty good understanding for how people in business and public sector, for that matter, think when they are in decision-making positions, which is probably quite important when we try to come up with solutions and funding of things that we discuss. After that experience, I became a scholar, and as part of that venture, I had the pleasure of working with both the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, OECD, and different disaster risk issues, how to deal with those, including terrorism risk, by the way, which is hard to pinpoint and calculate the risk of, and the governance of risk in general. So I guess I represent kind of a mixture of both practice in finance management and scholarship. So I guess that's my background. Now also, as mentioned last, I was a former chairman of Axilo and now a member of the Cora Foundation board, which the UNDP has engaged with on sense-making processes that, well, are precursors to some of the things I'll discuss today. So the way I have engaged in these discussions, I have evolved into a focus on what I call strategic risk management, which is basically how do organizations deal with major issues that hit organizations? How can they adapt to things that are hard to quantify, sometimes hard to identify, and yet you need to respond to? I refer to that as strategic risk management and the leadership of this. So I'm just referring to a recent book, not that you need to buy it. It's actually available free of charge on the internet because it's considered COVID-19 relevant. But anyways, one of the key points that we try to point out in this book is that, yes, we are in a turbulent world and things change abruptly and often with extreme effects. And we are really exposed to this more than we think. Where the natural response, as Svetla mentioned, really is, and we see many examples of this, is to impose control-based approaches on organizations, whether they're public or private. We see it in both spheres. And we claim that's not really the appropriate way to deal with the unexpected. You need to embrace uncertainty, and you need to kind of mentally prepare for it and find ways of exploiting the opportunities that also arise out of new situations. So take COVID-19. Yes, we need to live in a different way. We need to interact now more via the internet, etc. But that also creates new opportunities. And maybe it's not a situation where we want to go back to the old world, but we want to adapt and take the advantages that the new situation presents. Another part of my insights, if you will, come out of research we have conducted over the past couple of years in what we call this Global Strategic Responsiveness Initiative. And there's a book series publishing some of the findings around this. So it's just to say that some of these research results also inspire this presentation. So basically, the underlying premise here is, and that I suggest, is that both public and private organizations can actually be catalysts for systemic change. So some organizations, I didn't say many, but some organizations can adapt, and they're very good at it. I'm interested to know how they do it and how we can learn from that. But it's a difficult discipline, just to make sure of that. On the other hand, many of the issues we are dealing with are not just something the individual organization can deal with. COVID-19, well, it's a global phenomenon. It doesn't look at rich or poor. It doesn't look at color or religion or anything. We are human beings, and we interact, and we all influence each other. So it needs a global solution. In other words, organizations also need to find ways to collaborate to find proper solutions. You cannot find them by yourself alone. So there's some interactions there that we hopefully will be able to discuss further towards the end of the presentation. So again, much of my insight here is informed by research on organizational structures and how organizations, effective organizations, set up their strategy making processes. And my premise is that it's important. I'm at a business school, right? So my view, and I'm probably biased slightly here compared to some of the prior presenters, but it's very important, I think, to engage the business community into this in collaboration with both the public sector entities, government, and also the plural sector to generate solutions that will be sustainable for society. So that was just some general thoughts, the background for what I hopefully can contribute with here. 3 common observations that hopefully can frame this a little bit. Yes, we are impacted much more than we like to think by major abrupt events. COVID-19 is one example. So we are being taken by surprise. We need to do something, and we react. So one take of this is, as opposed to reacting, try to be proactive. I mean, none of us can disagree on that. So I'm just making maybe an obvious point, but keeping this in mind, I think, is important. Another thing is when you're affected by abrupt and unexpected events, you need to deal with the immediate symptoms. You need to help when help is needed, and you need to support and prepare recovery. But what we really need is to all of us become catalysts for future solutions. So again, in the case of COVID-19, try to look at the opportunities it represents, as opposed to try to recover and get back to the old ways. And again, that's what the third point reiterates, I suppose. But since we all have scarce resources and capacity, there is a tendency to use the focus to remedy existing systems and rebuild them, where we actually need to invest more in innovation and experimentation. And in reality, it's the only way we can deal with the unexpected, because we don't know in advance what the solution is. So just a few definitions to when we talk about risk management, what is that actually? Well, it refers to, in my view, risk as measurable uncertainty. In other words, we have an insurance sector, we have a financial sector that is very good at calculating different risks, and that's an example of measurable uncertainty. Even when you deal with catastrophe risks and so forth, or exposures, there are ways in which you can do simulations, etc. You can quantify. So risk is when you can measure something. Now it requires that you have events or deal with circumstances that you can categorize and measure. Now, uncertainty is everything else when you can't measure things. So if events are abrupt, different every time, have different consequences and so forth, you cannot do it. It's unquantifiable. If you're unexpected to the unknown, if you don't know what happens to you next, and we are exposed to these situations, it's pretty obvious you can't calculate things in advance. And the subtle point I'm trying to make is that in reality, our biggest challenge is not risk. We know how to do this. The biggest risk is uncertainty and dealing with the unexpected and the unknown. So just a few points. I don't need to go through all the text here, but there is a human tendency to, if we are faced with uncertainty, even if it represents opportunity, we try to go back and we change things into risks so we feel more comfortable dealing with them in a controllable manner. And it has a number of consequences that I try to list here. Short-termism, the fact that we try to plan and control things when we implement, and not really seeing the big opportunities when they arise. So one take of this, also looking at study of risk events in general, when the big events happen and organizations are impacted, the most impactful risk management failures, when you look at different incidents that are being reported in the press and so forth, and you study them more closely, they're typically linked to some cognitive limitations around decision makers. Now here I say the C-suite, just to enforce the point that it's decision making. So we have some cognitive limitations when we think about the uncertainty that surrounds us and the opportunities that we represent. And of course, this is, as a consequence of this, something I think we need to address. Another subtle observation, I guess, is that when you look at social systems, the economic systems, the economies in which we operate, they evolve. They're not stable. They evolve all the time through social interactions. In other words, they follow a path-dependent course. They're irreversible. They never go back to the same state. So when we look at the economy today, it's different from the economy of yesterday and yesteryear. And that has a certain consequence. It means that if you want to be able to adapt to the unexpected that happened right in the forefront of this, you need to be alert. And certainly if you are in a commercial organization, you need to be able to respond to things when they happen. Otherwise, you'll lose behind. To some extent, you can say the same thing to public sector organizations, although the consequence is not quite the same, but you might have an inefficient way of responding nonetheless. So be observant and lead the path. It's difficult to reverse also if you overcommit in certain directions, so you shouldn't do that. Just to illustrate, if the world is uncertain, this is very simple. There might be 3 directions. Which one is going to happen? Well, we think this, so we commit in this direction. But what if we were wrong? We cannot reverse our irreversible resource commitments. So staying at a path with small steps is a very sound principle in these kind of circumstances, because you don't know what happens next, basically. So this is another subtle observation, I guess, based on my own experience, and I guess the UNDP certainly will be able to relate to this, that a lot of multilateral support is donated when entities, regions, countries are suffering. When some major events happen and people suffer, there is very often extra help forthcoming. The problem, of course, is with, well, first of all, it might create some moral hazards. So if this is always the case, you might tend to forget what do you need to do with precautions, etc. But there's a big problem when you have a major incident, say COVID-19, that affects every country around the world. because then you need to care for your own constituencies before anybody else. So I'm just mentioning this as an observation that trying to think of new ways of attracting funding in some collaborative ways is probably important when we deal with these kind of situations. So yeah, generating new type of financing, trying to develop co-evolving business environments that also engage commercial enterprise together with government entities, I suggest is one perspective. And some of the examples we have seen certainly yesterday also had corporate participants. Now we can discuss further, hopefully, how that engagement should take place. How do organizations today typically deal with these kind of issues when you have to do with risk, uncertainty, which people often don't distinguish between? We try to distinguish between risk and uncertainty, but often it's a mesh. In modern portfolio theory, we are really talking about risk diversification. That's really the key principle there. So by having a portfolio of investments, you can eliminate the unsystematic risk, the risk that deals with the individual organization. So one consequence of this is it doesn't really matter what happens to the individual organization, but it also means that those different innovative initiatives that are idiosyncratic to each of the organizations kind of take a backseat. And I think that's a misfortune. When you look at venture capital and some of the initiatives that we have been discussing are actually venture capital type of engagements. But the premise as a venture capitalist is that if you invest in 10 initiatives, at least one of them that try to deal with an issue, at least one of them will become a blockbuster that then can secure the return for the organization. But that's not a very effective way of investing in innovation and exploration. So what I suggest is that instead we try to engage willing and interested, truly committed organizations, both in the public sector and the private sector, to commit funding for exploratory initiatives that try to collectively identify potential solutions. It is not, the perspective here is not that we have an idea as to what is the actual investment we need to make, developing a solution, but actually trying to explore what are potential elements of a solution to a major issue that we're dealing with. And the fact is, the only way under extreme uncertainty, when we really don't know where things are evolving, is that we need to experiment and learn by doing. That was mentioned several times yesterday as well. So that's the same principle. If we don't know where things are going, we need to experiment, do things, try things out, learn from it, and find out what works and what doesn't. Now, doing that, of course, also needs to be done in a particular way, so we don't overcommit. That was a point I made earlier. So it's something about achieving a balance between optimizing existing processes and committing enough resources to innovate for future renewal. It's a standard issue, I guess, in any business, where most businesses actually take a priority to the existing optimization of processes and tend to often forget the renewal and innovation part. And that's where part of the discussion and the convincing comes about when we try to engage both public and private organizations to this kind of initiative. In management, we often talk about the ambidextrous organization. Nice term, but it basically refers to the organization that is able to optimize both current operations as well as creating new innovations for the future. But it's a difficult thing to do. But it's a discussion that needs to be taken. So I suggest having upfront discussions about commitments to innovate, how much, and then that's a sidebar, but we can use real options logic to help our thinking. It's not a solution, it's just a suggestion that there are actually ways in which we can help our thinking about these things. We can discuss this in more detail if we want. The main point is we need to have upfront discussions about how much do we need to commit to this and have agreement about it. Some principles for prudent innovation: search for new insights, invest in small probes. That's important. Don't overcommit. Expand in small increments. And another important point, hone the collective intelligence and collaborative solutions. So collaborative platforms where people can meet and engage, invest in these kind of innovations is what we propose. In other words, create a network of relevant stakeholders, including both private organizations, commercial enterprise, governmental institutions, and organizations from the plural sector, social entrepreneurs, et cetera, et cetera. Establish platforms where they can meet and generate ideas. I also talk about space forms, which is basically just a multidimensional version of a platform. A platform is a marketplace where you meet and exchange. A space form, there are many more dimensions than two. So this is more a way of thinking and speaking to increase our ability to take many different perspectives into account. And finally, to learn from walking right in the front of things, and learn from the experimentation and use the updated insights as we go along. So those are some key principles. So commit sufficient resources towards these exploratory activities, I think, is a key point. Trying to balance the ability to optimize things we are doing. The UNDP organizations of any sort, public, private, they need to tend to the things they're there to take care of. So therefore, the ability to deal with the current is important, but you also need to care for and think about the renewal and innovate for the renewal. So the issue is, how do you do that? How do you organize that? And there are actually two schools of thought in management. One is referred to structural ambidexterity. Most of you have probably heard about these issues. They argue that if you make new initiatives, they have to be separated from the organization, so you don't get embedded in the old ways of thinking. But there is another perspective, the contextual ambidexterity, that argues, well, people that do the things, they have to be, in the daily work, they have to be involved to give their input as to how can we best take the next steps to improve the way we do things right now. Personally, I'm more towards the contextual ambidexterity issue, or thinking, but it's an open discussion. Now, the point I'd like to make is that having a platform where organizations actually collaborate together outside of their own organization, both have engagement of people that do the daily business because they have to engage in the discussions, and you have ways in which you try out new things on the platform. So I think it resolves the conundrum between the two, which is an interesting point, I think. And then finally, putting a platform together. Who should be on a platform? Well, depends on the issue you want to resolve. Yesterday, we looked at a very concrete issue of plastic pollution in the ocean in a large region in Indonesia. Now, who, you might ask, would have an interest in these? Well, pretty obviously some local government entities and so forth. And what are some of the corporate entities that might have an interest in this? We could think broadly about this. Now, again, plastic pollution in the sea is a very concrete, in this case also a regional concern that inspired the initiative, but it's a global phenomenon, and it relates to, well, plastic. Where I'm sitting, we have a lot of ocean, and we also use plastic all the time. Is it easy to resolve this? No. So my point is, it's a global issue. It's a higher level issue that we might be able to create a broader platform for that can engage different constituents that provide different perspectives on this for concrete development of concrete workable solutions. So I'm getting very close to my final version. I'll try to speed up a little bit, but the key point I'm trying to say here is that we need experiential learning to move forward to find solutions to the big issues that we're dealing with in the world. And we can discuss what those are. It's, of course, much more than plastic in the ocean. There are many other issues that affect us. So having a list of issues we all together need to deal with is important. And once we have that, trying to deal with these issues, the solutions will have to come from experiential learning because we don't know the solutions. And if we take too big steps in one direction, there's a risk that we overcommit, and it becomes, we commit too many resources to a given solution, and it's harder to return back to a more flexible way of finding solutions together. I call it guided exploration. So in other words, there needs to be something in advance of this. I refer to this as causal learning, right? So we reason, we sit and discuss what are the issues we're trying to deal with, what are our different views, etc. Some people actually refer to this as sense making, right? So trying to figure out who we are, what we need to do, what the issues we're dealing with, and so forth, is a necessary precursor to experiential learning. Now here, the guided exploration, I suggest that we can actually create platforms or space forms to actually generate very concrete solutions involving different constituents with different perspectives and different input, both in terms of solutions, capabilities, etc., that can hone workable solutions for the future. And then, of course, if this is exploration, right? So it's not like we have the solution, but we try to explore what might constitute the right solution that we then can execute more thoroughly in practice, which I refer to as effectual learning. So when you actually think you have found something that is a viable solution, you start implementing in organizations, probably the ones that were involved to begin with in the platform, so they get a return from what they actually invested in the learning process. But again, when you do that, you should do it in a stepwise, prudent manner, just according to the principles mentioned earlier. This is not a linear process. This is an ongoing, iterative, circular development process, right? So you continue this process along the way. And from an organizational perspective, you can see this, or you can interpret this as an interactive process between the central analytics at the corporate headquarters with a decentralized experiential insights you gain from executing and trying out and testing different things in the organization. So my claim is that interactive, fast, slow information processing between central reasoning, that's a slow process, that's a rational analytical thinking, must interact with emergent initiatives. That's a fast way of getting new insights and updated insights. That's the key to adaptive organizational systems. or adaptive social systems in general, because you can apply the same thing to societies. And the interesting thing, I've learned this along the way, but this is really the same dynamic that the human cognition uses. That's how our brain works, which has proven some resilience over history, I suppose. So it's an interaction. In other words, experimentation in itself is not enough. The central reasoning is a very important part of this, but they have to interact in a dynamic way, which is a challenge. And some organizations can do it, but not many. So just to reiterate, the central reasoning, planning as we often call it, what's the problem there? The problem is that the decision makers, whoever we are, we fall in love with our plans and we forget to get updated. And there are also some psychological barriers that if we have a little more power in the organization, we tend not to listen so much to the inputs from the field. There's a lot of evidence to that. Now there's some new initiatives and you know, crowdsourcing, collective intelligence. In other words, if you have a problem to resolve, you can use the collective intelligence and outsource the solutions to the crowd. That's a very popular phenomenon. And the collective intelligence, it's very effective. The problem with that solution, though, is that once you get the solution, it might not have been the right problem you asked for. So you're solving the wrong problem perfectly. So again, it reiterates that the two sides, the rational thinking and the updating, has to go hand in hand, and it has to change in a relative dynamic pace. So it's I guess, well, open innovation platforms. There's a number of examples of that try to go out and seek solutions from a broader audience, which has a lot of good things to it, versus the space forms that actually look at collaborative solutions where people work together, but based on a previous thinking process and an ongoing thinking process. So if you have an open innovation platform, if people all abide by the same values, you can have some self-organization. You can develop solutions. It can happen, but the space form and the conscious thinking that goes into this, I claim is more effective. But that's a claim. So I basically, and I guess this is the last thing I have on my slide, think about space forms. Think about, right, this is a multi-dimensional illustration. Try to engage organizations from obviously the public sector, because we all have an interest in sustainable societies, but also the private sector, or not least. And again, I'm biased, I'm at a business school, but when I look out the window here, I can think of quite a few Danish, Nordic, Scandinavian, Northern European corporations that would take an interest in actually finding viable solutions, not just contributing to, in a philanthropic way, so to speak, having their name on something that looks good, but actually genuinely engaging, committing resources to finding viable future solutions. And then the plural sector, which many of the presenters in the series actually belong to. So a nice unison of these three types of constituents on space forms or platforms, if you want to use that simpler term, I suggest could be a viable approach to find new solutions, but also attract new types of funding that are committed in a way that creates solutions. In other words, there is skin in the game, as they say. You commit resources and you also expect to get some concrete solutions out of it. So I guess I better stop here. But there are quite a few major issues that we can discuss, I hope. So I'm certainly open to questions, critiques, or any comments people might have.
Thank you so much, Torben. And thank you for everyone that is still live with us at the moment. We're
Those
gonna.
that didn't fall asleep, you mean?
No, it was very insightful. Thank you for the presentation. And yeah, we'd like to open up the session for discussion, and some questions have already been popping up. So I'm going to go forward and group them and pose them to you, Torben. So one
Sure.
of the questions has been, from your experience as an academic and a practitioner, what enables organizations to become more adaptive? Are there any preconditions which are needed? This is a question from Leila Sadiku.
I think it's a very good question. I wish I had the complete answer. By the way, I'm Danish, right? So I'm just honest. If I don't know the answer, I say it. And I know they're different cultures, I don't pretend to know things that I don't know. But it doesn't mean that I don't have anything to say about it. From what I observe broadly, and it's looking at strategy making process, how organizations set that up. It's also based on studies of organizations where they have major risk crisis and so forth. When you study those phenomena, in my experience, it is rarely the operational issues that crank things. People do their jobs, and in most cases, that's not really what turn over an organization. It typically has to do with the way, decision makers act. In other words, what kind of room do executives or senior decision makers in an organization give to open conversations about things, to share information, to listen to updated insights, to revise plans in a systematic way. It doesn't even have to be systematic, but in an open and dynamic way. So in many ways, I think it has to do with management attitude. And when I talked about these platforms and space forms and how do we get people in there, I think this is an important point. We have to go out and talk to the right people because they are there. But there is a tendency when you become, just put yourself in the situation. You get in a situation where you have a lot of responsibility, right? So you do have a responsibility to take care of the things you are there to do. So there is a tendency to take first priority to the things you need to do. And there's also often a priority to do that as efficiently as possible, right? Optimize things. But if you forget the renewal part, that's where the issues come in. So depending on your horizon as a senior decision maker, if you want to have quick successes, you become short-termist. And of course, that's not so good. So what can I say? It has to do with leadership attitudes. Unfortunately, or I don't know if it's unfortunate or not, but I think it's a reality. In some cases, it also relates to the moral habitus of people, right? So that's a side issue. And it's not so much the COVID-19, but look at the financial crisis, which is another major event. It did come about because some people actually overcommitted in a belief that it was the right thing to do for shareholders, optimizing things. But there were certainly quite a few people in the game that did it for their own sake, for their own pocket money, so to speak. So in other words, there's some moral issues involved in this as well. I'm not sure how clear that answer was, but yes, so attitude from leadership, broadly defined, key decision makers in organizations, and the way they structure the organization in decision making and sharing information and so forth.
Okay, thanks.
That's broadly leadership, which is not it's not a clear discipline, so to speak. something you have to experience, I think.
Thanks. We have some questions popping up around space forms and platforms. So one is
Yes.
posed by Julio. His question is, can you please elaborate on the distinction between, for example, MIT Climate Collab and, for example, space forms and platforms?
Well, I'm not an expert in MIT Climate Collab, but MIT they've been in the forefront in trying to hone crowdsourced solutions of different sorts. Also, very much issues, climate solutions, right? So they have identified climate change and ways of getting sustainable solutions to that as a key issue. So they go out to the crowd and they try to collect different inputs as to how can we resolve this. So they identify a problem and they try to crowdsource the solutions. Now, in I call it space form, but again, whether we call a platform a space form doesn't make much difference necessarily. I mean, space form kind of indicates that it's not just a two-dimensional meeting place. There are many dimensions at play, so you can call it a space form. That's what I try to illustrate here. But here, you actually you try to engage different types of organizations that take a genuine interest in the issues. In other words, when you talk to the senior decision makers, because you need to commit some funding for this, when you talk to the senior decision makers in these organizations, they have to buy into and be honest about their purpose of engaging in this. They truly believe that we need to experiment to find the future solutions for sustainable collaborative solutions. And part of the trick is, of course, also to find out who are those kind of organizations. What are some good combinations? Well, they need to cover different aspects of the problem or the issue that nobody else covers. So when I talk about private sector, I mean, if you want to resolve things like climate change, I mean, who are the organizations that use the energy? To a large extent, it's private sector entities. Although when I say private sector, it's many things. It's production, it's transportation, etc. Right? So it's many different aspects, but different industry sectors could and should probably be engaged in this to give their input into this. Public sector entities, well, obviously there's a lot of environmental departments in around the world, if you look at particular countries, and in the plural sector, I mean, there are many organizations that take an interest in environment and the climate. So finding a good mixture of people and organizations, people in organizations that cover different aspects of the future solutions is important, right? So when you create, let's call the space form since it's written here. When you create the space form and you invite the people in, commit investment for it, you will go through a sense-making process beforehand, right? So there's some thinking that goes into this. So not to find the solution we need to invest in, but a discussion as to what are, in this case, there are 6 dots, right? So there might be 6 areas where we need to know more. So we can invest in those 6 areas to gain experiential learning. So we can invest money in different initiatives. It could be a venture. If somebody's doing something interesting, we can learn from. It could be a research venture at a university, for that matter. It could be many different things. But when you put that into the space form and you generate new insights from that in an interactive discussion among the constituents in the space form, you can create together using the collective intelligence of all participants to find better, in an iterative way better solutions to deal with the concrete problems. For example, plastic in the ocean. The discussion was actually on and off a bit yesterday. It's not just about getting the plastic out of the oceans, right? It's how we actually use material in the industry. How do we wrap our things? And it's very, very complex. I mean, and the issue is with complex issues like that, there's not a single entity that can find the solution. You need collaborative solutions. And you probably need, that's the argument here, you need experimentation. You need to try out different things to see what works and what doesn't. And that's what a space form can do. It can identify the areas where you can experiment in a smart way so you don't overcommit in a major solution you think is right, but it might not be. You try to find the small pieces that can lump a solution together with you, and you hone the collective intelligence of diverse experts, so to speak, because they all have very important input to the solution. And we need the collaborative solutions for the future, for these kind of issues, right? It's not an operational issue for a given organization. It's a societal issue that involves certainly these three constituents. That's a lot of talk. I hope that clarified some issues around this thinking.
Definitely. I think it also answered one of the next questions in terms of giving an example of a space form. I think the initiative with regards to the plastics pandemic and what's happening in Indonesia, I think that can very much be viewed as an example of such a space form. And this was what was presented in the previous
just a quick comment. I noted the discussion yesterday, which was interesting, right? So I think it was Ben Dixon who mentioned the World Economic Forum as something very positive. You know, you get world leaders from these sectors to meet together and discuss issues. But he made the subtle point, well, discussing issues, of course, that's positive, but you need to find the solutions. Conversely, there was also this discussion about why do you commit funding? Is it because you want to show yourself as a philanthropist? In other words, as marketing, we contribute to this and we're good? Or are you actually in there with a genuine wish to find solutions? And when I talk about space form, I talk about the latter kind of contributions. I don't know how clear that is, but in other words, we are here not to feel good, right? We're here with real commitments and real contributions with our own capabilities and insights to find viable solutions for the future. And by doing it that way, you also have the opportunity and the possibility to develop the competences and capabilities you need to implement the eventual solutions, which is not so easy. If you want to change an organization, you also need new capabilities to do it. And that's what the space form can help you develop.
Thank you, Torben. So I'd like to pose another question that's come up. We are having a lot of questions right now. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to them all. But in terms of many of today's development gaps, which are unfortunately not the result of genuine uncertainty, but rather very predictable certainty, such as weak governance or lack of resources to take proven solutions to scale, does structured experimentation have a role in overcoming such challenges? And can it help us to be proactive even when the course of events is highly predictable? For example, we knew that COVID could cause health system collapse in certain countries before it happened.
Yes, that's a funny thing. You know, when I say unexpected things, should it be unexpected? No, it shouldn't. We've heard about viral infections before, right? And some countries in Asia were very good at dealing with this because they'd been exposed to it before. Why were the rest of us ignorant? Yeah, so it's a fun, you know, Why did the financial crisis happen? I mean, it's not that we didn't have warnings, but everybody did the same thing and tried to squeeze the last dollar out of the positions. In most cases, I hope, because people thought they were doing the right thing. In other cases, to make gains for their own benefit. Yeah. So how do we? Yeah. In other words, sometimes the unexpected should be expected, but that's a human flaw, right? It has to do with our short-term way of thinking often, that we try to deal with the issues we have right here. Whether you're a politician that deals with public money, or you're governing a private organization, you have a responsibility for the resources you have and doing the best out of those. So it's an understandable reaction that you try to deal with the now and the short term. And we tend to forget the really bad things that can happen not far down the road, but if it hasn't happened recently, we tend to ignore it. That's a psychological phenomenon. How do we deal with that? It's a slightly different. I'm not sure a space form by itself can resolve that problem, but a space form should, there should be a negotiation and discussion process going on beforehand, so the constituents on the space form are the people that honestly want to find solutions and they realize we need to get it. And once we can get some of these going, I think a lot has been gained. On the other hand, yeah, I mean, do we know all the big problems? Well, climate change, if I should mention, it should be the first priority of all of us. And it's not that's not an issue of development, well, developed world versus developing world. I mean, it's a global issue. We all dependent on finding solutions. Now, how do we do that? You know, we need collaborative solutions, and we need global solutions for that. So that said, also a thing we didn't discuss, but when you look at this as a global issue, what about politics? Has a major influence on the way you talked about governance, of course, which is part of the same thing. How do you govern your local governments, etc.? But it's also politics. If you look at the risk landscape, I mean, how do you foresee political developments? It's pretty much, I mean, if you want to find an area where you're exposed to uncertainty, it's in politics. And global politics will play a major role for the kind of solutions we can find together. Now, how do we deal with that? We have to do our best. We have to try to collect all the best wills and powers and people to find solutions, and that'll point the way. I believe that's true, but it's not proven.
Thanks.
And I suggest that Spaceform could be one way to actually get some practical solutions. But these are really, really big issues, and there are no easy answers, unfortunately. Doesn't mean we should despair. When I look at this series, I mean, I listen to all the fantastic people that show great engagement trying to resolve all kinds of issues. I think that's very positive. So there are a lot of efforts out there. What I'm kind of suggesting is that maybe there's some more effective ways in which we can hone those initiatives and energy. And again, I'm biased, private sector must be involved, because that's where the solutions will come from. Or rather, they have to implement the solutions, you know, so we get all our physical things. We all have to live. We need to have our physical things in the right way, in a sustainable way. So private sector is certainly important.
Since we
They're
have
all important, but private sector is also important. Yeah.
Since we have, we're coming to the end of the webinar, we'd like to maybe give, if you have 5 more minutes, Torben, we'd like to give an opportunity to pose 1 or 2 more questions if you're up for it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So there's been a couple of questions kind of centered around as a follow-up to our first great question from Leila Sadiku in terms of adaptive organizations. So in your experience, what kind of things can decision makers do themselves to make sure that they're embracing this mindset, or what can employees do to push their own decision makers, the management, to adapt such a mindset? Are there any insights that you've seen that you can share with us today?
Well, to start with the decision makers, if you are a decision maker, be conscious about these things, right? And think about it and try to avoid the potential downsides that we know exist in organizations, and try to be open to, first of all, information sharing, participatory decision processes, and listening to the updated information from the organization and from stakeholders in general. And well, that's easy to say. Now, when we talk to, I'm in the part of the world where we claim, or at least studies show, that the power distance between top and bottom is relatively low. We seem to have open communication between different hierarchical levels and so forth. And there's a lot of truth to that. But even when you go and talk to local organizations, when you talk to senior executives, middle management decision makers, and you discuss these things, they're in total agreement with you, and they say that's exactly what we do. Now, when you then go and talk to the people on the floor that actually do the things and have the experiences, we hear a different story, right? So it's difficult, right? It's not because of bad will. It's about the way we. Well, if you're a senior decision maker, I mean, how much time do you have to think about these things? But you probably need to take time to think about these things, and be conscious about it. That's probably the best advice I can give. Be conscious about it and try to think about it, and try to do something actively about it. Now, if you're the person that are out in the field and actually doing this stuff, and you're frustrated because people don't listen and so forth, well, what do? I have a son who's now an engineer and out working in real life, and he's frustrated with certain things. And all I can say is, well, learn from it. And when you become the decision maker, do the right thing. So if you're down on the floor, you can't change the organization. It's difficult. But of course, you can speak your mind. And in good organizations, you can't speak your mind. But it's not an organization you can't speak your mind. So you have to decide personally what you want to do. Do you want to speak your mind and take the consequences of that, or do you want to find other ways? I'm not sure how good advice that was, but that's probably the best shot I can give.
Will respond.
Listen, time is short and so forth, but if people can get my email easily, internet, and if you have issues and things you want to discuss, please feel free to send me an email. I check my email every day, so no problem.
Okay, as time is running short, I think we'll put a cap. I'm sorry for all of the questions, the good questions that have been posed already that we won't be able to get to. But as Torben has kindly offered, we can share your email to those of you who have participated in the webinar if you'd like to follow up with further questions. So thank you, Torben, very much for accepting our invitation to take part, and to every one of you who dialed in today to listen to us, to our last webinar, part of our series on strategic recovery for COVID-19. So thank you all. We'll be circulating the recording today, so if you'd like, you could share it with colleagues and others, as well as the recording from yesterday. So if you have also any other ideas in terms of speakers you'd like for us to invite for future webinars, please feel free to reach out to us as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely week.
Thank you.